Thank you all for coming. Oh, excellent. I am wired for sound. I'm very excited to be talking to Ben and Martha today. And the topic is, of course, the rise of digital medication as an alternative to drugs. So I wanted to kick off the conversation by letting both Ben and Martha introduce themselves and really give their definition for what a digital medication is. So Martha, would you like to start?
I'd be happy to. So I'm Martha Lawrence. I'm the CEO of AccendoWave. And AccendoWave is a machine learning technology company that measures pain and helps manage pain. We do full spectrum brain analysis, and we correlate your brain waves with your perception of pain, distress, or nausea. By training, I'm a hospital executive. I was with Hospital Corporation of America for 18 years. And HCA actually incubated this technology. It's been out for almost 5 years, and we actually have the largest real-time database on pain. We have just shy of 68,000 patients who have used the technology in the hospital, every department, including ICU. And then in terms of definition regarding digital medicine, I would say it's sort of under the umbrella of digital health. And it's really software in combination with data-driven or algorithm-driven products to measure or intervene to improve human health. And that's how I would describe it.
Great, thank you. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself and answer the question?
And I do not have a health background. Personally, I've worked at companies like Google and Facebook, and I've started other companies in the past that are doing things like ad tech and mobile entertainment, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And I started this company and brought on a lot of health expertise to the team because we saw a real problem that technology might be able to address.
Excellent. So I love that we have two panelists from very different backgrounds that are approaching two very different problems in this space. I'd like to understand from both of you where you see trends happening that have made what you're doing possible, or put another way, why now? Why is there this moment that seems to be happening?
Well, for us in the pain space, one of the things that's really impacted what we're doing is the opioid crisis. So hospitals are actually required by their regulator, the Joint Commission, to offer a non-pharma pain treatment modality in the hospital. So this is an unfunded mandate, so the hospitals have to provide it, but they don't get reimbursement for it. Technology is a much less expensive option for the hospitals, so the Joint Commission mentions things like complementary therapy, acupuncture, chiropractic, massage therapy, and those are really great and evidence-based, problematic in the hospital, right? Nobody becomes a massage therapist to work the night shift at the hospital. And so you really have to look at solutions that can respond to the requirement, that are cost-effective, right, because you don't get reimbursement for it, that are available 24/7, and have the option to assist in reducing opioid usage within the hospital environment. So that's really impacted us and sort of the interest in what we're doing.
And on our side, it's similar. There's the combination of a market need combined with regulatory changes that have opened up this landscape. And I love the question because whenever you're pitching to an investor, it's one of the most important questions to answer is why now? And in our case, we are taking advantage of changes in the regulatory environment that allow mobile apps and other technology to go through the FDA and be cleared as both safe and efficacious, and then be prescribed. And a handful of the larger companies in our space, like Paratherapeutics, have already paved the way and gotten some of their products through, and other larger companies are well ahead of us on the clinical trial pathway towards getting approved relatively soon, some this year, some next year. But that's certainly exciting because with those regulatory changes, we're now able to build our software in a way that plays within the healthcare system rather than trying to circumvent it. And on the other hand, for Limbix specifically, we're building products that are designed to treat adolescent mental health disorders, where we're seeing a giant unmet need. So the focus on mental health disorders has been on the rise since the dawn of the century, and that is a good thing because more people are getting diagnosed and more people are getting treated today than they were 20 years ago. However, we don't have a magical increase in the number of psychologists or psychiatrists available to treat these problems. So today, more than ever, pediatricians specifically do not have a lot of options for their patients that are showing signs of depression, anxiety, or other mental health disorders. Psychologists have incredibly long wait lists, especially those that take insurance. And so because of that, our doctors are more desperate now than ever for other solutions that do not require them to put patients on a long wait list.
Great. So I hear this need for quality care where there's a gap in being able to meet patient needs, patient demand, and I also hear about these regulatory changes. So Ben, can you say more about, if someone is looking to take an e-therapeutic from start all the way to approval, what that's like compared to classic drug medication?
So it's a great question, but let's keep in mind I have done neither of those things. So take this with a grain of salt, but it is a similar process in that you need to have multiple clinical trials showing both safety and efficacy, as well as working with the FDA along the process. So keep in mind, from a prescription digital therapeutic perspective, only a handful of apps have made it through so far, with more coming. But it comes down to you need your pre-sub meeting with the FDA where you send them your designs ahead of time for both your product as well as your placebo. And this is something that actually is a big difference between our line of work and a pharmaceutical, where the placebo for a drug is a sugar pill, and that's relatively constant from what I'm understanding. But in our case, we have to build our placebo app that we'll be using for our upcoming trial. And a placebo app isn't just a one-size-fits-all. We have to mimic the same sort of things you'll be doing in our app, but remove what makes it clinically effective. So that is very difficult, and each placebo app I expect will be evaluated separately by the FDA, and they will say, yeah, this is good, or no, go back to the drawing board and redesign it. But we're still talking about a handful of trials with increasingly larger sample sizes that are designed to show efficacy, as well as then that expensive process where we take all the results, send them to the FDA, they give us 180 days, and then they give us the clearance we need.
Great. So I hear some similarities and some things which are slightly different. Martha, I think you've taken a different path. Can you share your thoughts on that?
We have a very different strategic path. So we haven't gone through the FDA, and our technology has been out almost for 5 years. So the FDA was at a different place 5 years ago than they are today, and the advice that we got at the time was, don't go to the FDA. They won't understand what you're doing. It'll be really expensive, and you'll get stuck. And so what we determined was a way to sort of thread the needle so that it didn't require the FDA, but we were still able to gather this sort of significant amount of data on our technology. So our technology doesn't connect into the electronic health record, which would tie us into going to the FDA. And it also isn't being used to treat or diagnose patients at this point. It's just a data point around how they're feeling while they're in the hospital. It's positioned as a patient satisfaction platform. And that's how we brought the technology out. And for our hospitals, I would tell you that kind of having that FDA stamp wasn't as important as it might be in some other areas. And part of that, just given my bias and my background, I would tell you, and most patients don't realize this, but when you're in our hospitals and you can't tell us your pain, we just stare at you and we guess. Now, we try to make educated guesses, but that's what we're doing. And so the bar on this, in fact, it wasn't my hospital system, but it was another one who just said, the bar on this, Martha, is resting on the ground. Whatever we need, we will gather with you, right? Because we're pointing at little faces on a chart, or we're saying, what your level of pain is on a scale of 1 to 10. And so the hospital systems were willing to sort of almost in essence do those trials and gather that data with us. And so our intent is to go to the FDA. It'll probably be as a result of some of the pharma relationships that we have. But as it's currently positioned, we're able to be in our hospital environments, gather that data, and when we do go to the FDA, we'll arrive with a boatload of data.
Great. And it seems to me that anyone in the room who has had someone experiencing either acute pain in a hospital or chronic pain, that what I'm hearing is this is a better solution in some ways to opioids. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about just how you would compare the efficacy of your therapeutic, or more broadly, e-therapeutics, to really the drug they're competing with.
Sure. So I'll kind of take that patient perspective first. So patients are really interested in having an alternative in the hospital. So it's not really that difficult to get them to take it. They're smart. They're reading about this opioid crisis, and they want another option while they're in the hospital. So we actually do a significant amount of measurement, having come from a very evidence-based company. So we measure their average level of pain, their maximum level of pain, how long they're using the technology, their patient satisfaction with the technology. We have one of our hospitals that's actually doing a magnet study where they're looking at opioid reduction, they're looking at length of stay, they're looking at patient satisfaction. And some of you from hospital systems may have already sort of seen this in your data, but HCA is seeing a real link between opioid usage and length of stay. So the longer they're on opioids, the longer they're staying with us. So with our technology, it's really a very active process. So pharmacy every day identifies the patients in the hospital that are on high doses of opioids. I'll call them our high flyers. So they're on, and it's everywhere in the hospital, including ICU. And we have our own staff that's embedded in the hospital. So we have pre-med college students who are credentialed, who are considered Tier 2 employees. We've got an employee there every day that's handing this technology out in a consistent way. So I'm not relying on the clinical staff who's really up to here in terms of workload, and you can't just add one more thing unless you want to take a few things away from them. So we're actually providing that technology to them, and in half the cases they're taking AccendoWave. So I'm not really worried about opioid reduction in terms of what we're doing because we're seeing that on an anecdotal basis. But it's because we're really taking this active process in trying to reduce opioid usage in the hospital in a very consistent way, as opposed to relying on our clinical staff who is just really stretched and may not, and they can do it in the middle of the night or when things aren't terribly busy, but during most of their shift, they're pretty impacted. And this has been a very meaningful way to gather the data. We provide data to our hospitals every week, so they see metrics on how, by department, how long they're using it, all the average levels, the maximum levels, and then we produce a joint commission report as well for them, free of charge. Because I would tell you as a hospital operator, it drives me crazy when vendors want to charge me for my own data back. And so we provide that free of charge, and it provides all of that data. We quantify by department. We use a 5-point scale. How are the 5 levels of pain showing up in each of those departments? And there's special data that we're providing in that the NIH has a call to action around gender data. Women are underrepresented in the research data and specifically in pain research data. And we're in labor and delivery. So we've got a lot of data on women in pain. So depending on how our stakeholders want that evidence-based information, we're providing it to them, not sort of flooding them with data, but actionable data that's helpful and meaningful to them.
So I think it's amazing that you have something that is purely electronic, that's not a molecule, that's successfully competing with one of the most addictive substances that I'm aware of. So that's incredible.
Yeah, thank you.
Ben, in your space, how would you compare what you're doing to the efficacy, both the risk and the rewards of traditional treatments?
So again, it's going to depend on the disorder. In the space of depression, as an example, there are 2 SSRIs that are considered on-label for adolescents. Because there are increased side effects when it comes to the younger population, most notably an increase in risk of suicide. That doesn't mean you should ever prescribe antidepressants to teenagers, but ultimately because of that increased risk, most of the SSRIs are not considered on-label. The fact is there's always going to be a space for pharmacological solutions and for both depression and as well as other disorders, and including pain, right? Like the solutions will not go away. The question will be, can you minimize their use, or can you have other first lines of defense? For instance, technology in the hospital for acute pain, or in our case, can a digital therapeutic help reduce the symptoms of depression so that maybe someone who was severe is now only moderately severe, or maybe even moderate or mild, in which case they no longer need that prescription for antidepressants. And so it's one of those things which needs to be studied pretty carefully, but a lot of people are looking for non-pharmacological solutions to specific disorders. And one of the other players in our space is Kehle technology. And they're building a video game designed specifically to treat ADHD. And as we all know, right now the treatment that is most prescribed is Adderall, and it can be very effective, but there are a lot of side effects to Adderall. And so a lot of parents, myself included, would be much more inclined to try Kehle's product before doing the prescription approach.
That's excellent. You can think of it as this is your first course of treatment, and that's more conservative. And then if you have to, you go to something which potentially has risk associated with it.
Exactly. And so anxiety disorders is somewhat similar, right? Like one of the first things a psychiatrist will do for anxiety right now would be prescribe antidepressants. But if those don't work, then they prescribe the more dangerous benzos, right? It's fairly standard that way.
Great. So for all of these, when I think of a traditional medication, someone seeking treatment has to go see a clinician. Perhaps that's subsidized, probably that's subsidized by insurance. Then a script needs to be written. There's this whole chain to actually get the medication to the patient. What ways potentially, either for what you are working on or in general in this field, do you see that changing, or do you see that pretty much being the same model?
So in the hospital environment, because they have this regulatory requirement, they're paying for it, the technology, and they're not billing the patients, they're not billing their insurance company, they're covering the cost. For other segments, the challenge I think that we see is that from a payer perspective, whether it's CMS or Medicaid or a group health payer, they're paying for things that we don't want our patients to take, like opioids. And they're not paying for things that we want them to do, like AccendoWave. And so there's a real disconnect in terms of kind of reimbursement methodology and sort of where innovation and technology is today. I think what we really should be doing is looking 20 years out, and what's the reimbursement methodology that maps out to that, so that we're not always playing catch up in terms of what we're doing. But that's really the scenario that we find ourselves in today, where the reimbursement methodologies just haven't kept pace with what's happening in the marketplace. And I think that's really important in terms of access to this kind of technology for certain groups that may not have the financial wherewithal or may not be at a facility that's providing that technology. So that's the challenge I think we find ourselves in.
Great. Ben, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, it's definitely a challenge in our space as well. And we see employers being a large reimburser. So like companies like Livongo or Omada are finding a ton of success with digital therapeutics getting through the employer programs. And that makes sense. Where we have yet to see as much success is the traditional payer reimbursement provider prescribed model. And so there certainly is some elements of success there by the therapeutics that have gotten approved, but it's still limited compared to traditional pharma companies. And we are making a bet as a startup today that the industry is going to evolve over the next 2 to 3 years as we go through the regulatory process so that getting reimbursement is easier. And that's the type of bet a startup wants to make, because if the industry evolves, we'll be in great shape, assuming we get through the FDA. And if the industry doesn't evolve, well, so much, there's a risk in betting on a startup in the first place. But it does seem like payers will evolve, and it might take consortiums like AdvaMed, which is here at the conference, trying to work with the government to make it easier for startups like us to get reimbursed by CMS. And it might take more evolved conversations with payers, showing them the ROI. Just like Martha's product is more cost-effective for payers, right, than an opiate prescription, as an example. It'd be great to see that reimbursement so that it's even cheaper for hospitals to adopt, or even cheaper for patients to take home. These conversations take a long time. The studies take forever. And what our advisors are having us do is start those conversations now, even before our product is proven to be effective. And maybe even running some simultaneous health economic outcome research studies with payers alongside, so that when we do get through the FDA, we can hit the ground running and negotiate reimbursement, where some of the earlier players in our space started those conversations later, and so they got through the FDA, but it was 6 months, a year later before they saw real reimbursement from payers.
And I would just add, I've talked a lot about kind of our hospital channel, but we actually have 3 other B2B channels and 1 B2C channel. So our second channel, and just kind of that from that payer, who pays for this, is biotech and pharma. So we've got 3 confidentiality agreements with global pharma companies who are interested in our technology for clinical trials, for consumer health, and actually the most interesting, I think, is value-based care and being able to differentiate drugs, how well they work, how long they work, and how well they work relative to other drugs. So they would be sort of paying for that. The third is a data, so we have a confidentiality agreement with a global data company, and the next one is device, and we've got a confidentiality agreement with a global device company. So those entities would be paying. The hospital one is a little bit different in terms of how it's defined.
Great. So before my next question, just to put a bug in everyone's ear, find Ben and Martha later if you're in the payer space and start these conversations, because it sounds like we can lower cost and get better outcomes for patients. So this is a great opportunity later to do that at MedTech. Ben had mentioned something which made me want to ask, how receptive are the funding communities to what you all are doing? If there's someone in the audience who's thinking about being an entrepreneur, what would you tell them about where to seek funding, what their strategies should be?
So that's a really important question and something that we struggled with over the past year. I've probably spoken to 150 different investors and gotten 149 different versions of no. And it can be a struggle. And so, an average investor, you might need to do 1,000 conversations. So definitely keep pushing. What we learned over the past year is if you're building a prescription digital therapeutic or something that needs to go through the regulatory process before you can start earning real money, most investors will not be interested. They have to have already committed as a fund to invest in something that's not going to have a real payoff for a few years before it's going to be a productive conversation. You're unlikely to go to an investor who wants to invest in the next Instagram, right, or the next Amazon and get them to invest in your digital therapeutic if they're expecting payback within 18 months or 24 months, right? It's just a very unproductive conversation. So there are a bunch of health VCs out there who are used to really long payback times, who used to see revenue, as they described it, that looks really flat like this for a while, and then a big spike or whatever. They're used to that. But of that group of investors, only so many are going to want to do like a new type of drug, in our case, prescription digital therapeutics. A lot of them might want to focus on more traditional pharma or more traditional medical devices. So now, in our case, we've got a very small subset of investors who would really have a productive conversation with us. And of those, how many want to invest before we have real clinical data? So there's seed funding, where you can have an idea or some early data or an early product, and then there's Series A funding, where you need to have a decent trial under your belt, and then there's Series B and so on. So you need to find the right stage investor who's committed to not having you make any money for a while, and then is up for investing, in our case, in digital therapeutics. So it is tough, but if you find them, you can have productive conversations, and we didn't need to have too many of those conversations before we were able to get our Series A term sheet last month.
So yes, congratulations. That's very impressive that you keep going and finding that person. It's true entrepreneur, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to do that. I was also thinking that UCLA TDG in the past has invested in early stage technology that's a traditional molecule, and to help get more data behind the efficacy, even if it's in an animal model, and that has made the tech more investable, and we've had some success with that. And so one of the things that I'm hearing is our group should be considering doing that as well for, even before there's a company wrapped around it, for this early stage e-therapeutic to get some valid data.
Oh, absolutely, right? If you can do a tech transfer from UCLA with a decent sized trial or a decent amount of data under your belt, you can go almost straight to a Series A or have really easy seed funding conversations because you have data behind what you're bringing. You're not just two people with an idea or an early product. There's real data, hopefully a patent behind it, and that can be very valuable to getting funding. I think Pear Therapeutics specifically started with a tech transfer out of some Northern California university, I believe, and that enabled them to get a decent amount of funding when they started their business.
Did you want to add to that?
I would just tell you that we chose a very different path. We were very contrarian. So we did not seek outside funding. And I would tell you, if you don't need it, don't take it. The early money is the expensive money. If you do need it, then that's certainly a way to go. But from our perspective, it's not necessarily an easier path, it's just a different path. And we always understood that at a micro level, we could help the patient with their pain experience. And we didn't talk about the content, but our content is sort of based on the brainwave. So whatever is calming you down and reducing your pain, your content starts changing based on your brainwave. So it's sort of brainwave controlled TV for pain. So we knew that that would be effective. But our greater value proposition would always be as a pain data company. The data that no one has. I mean, good luck in getting that out of your electronic health record. It doesn't matter if it's Epic or Cerner or Meditech. It's not available. So we knew that that would be important in terms of not only our hospital channel, but the other channels, and other channels being willing to work with us. So instead of expanding really quickly, what we did was we just put our head down at 5 HCA facilities and cranked out a massive amount of data. And when you have 150 to 250 people in the emergency department every day, your N gets really big really fast. And so rather than just going as quickly as you can, and I would tell you as a hospital operator, I would see a lot of these companies that would do that and they would just get stuck. And so we really didn't want that path. So we chose, a sort of more contrarian way in terms of how we approach the marketplace, strategic, we hope, but a different way in terms of our kind of growth. So we're cash flow positive. We've got 21 employees. We're at that point where we're scaling now, but we chose just a different path. And I think it's helpful to mention that to those entrepreneurs in the audience, that it just doesn't always have to be one route. There can be a variety of ways. And then I would mention kind of a funding model out of, so there's a really interesting funding model out of Houston, where the entire ecosystem has gotten together. So it's Memorial Hermann, it's Village MD, which are physicians, it's the children's hospitals, it's insurers, and they've sort of gathered together. They have a fund that's associated, so they're doing pilots, they're providing growth stage funding, they're providing mentoring. I think 8 of their 9 first companies came from California, and they're actually focused on female entrepreneurs. And if you sort of look at the VC funding, that tends to be quite a bit lower than other types of funding. So it's a very interesting model for the women CEOs, founders in the audience. I thought I would mention that to you. And there are a variety of ways that you can approach funding for your company. And there's some very creative approaches that I think are noteworthy.
We certainly have some support for the ecosystem here, and I think we can always have more. I think we can address different groups, and so I'd love to learn more about that model later to inspire what we're doing at UCLA and at TDG to help more people become successful entrepreneurs. Along those lines, I'm curious, because I believe you're both based in this area, what advantages would you say being local to LA could give a company in this space compared to other regional hubs?
So I would tell you that I think this conference is really a beautiful sort of manifestation of that. And that is, we have a variety of institutions that are working together. It's UCLA, it's USC, it's Cedars-Sinai's accelerator, it's Biocom. And forgive me if I'm not mentioning a couple of others that are a part of this ecosystem, but I think that sort of not using this as a competitive advantage, but working all together to create this innovation ecosystem is really important. And I think layered on top of that, you see LA County's interest, which is to foster the growth of life science, of healthcare here in the county, and really helping to drive initiatives around that. So we just feel really grateful and appreciative to be a part of an ecosystem that's organizing itself that way, and I think we're going to see great potential, growth and development in our marketplace because of that approach. So delighted to be here, and I really think this conference is just a beautiful example of that.
Great, thank you.
Look, I don't have a ton to add. I think everything Martha said was accurate. The only thing is that we came from the Bay Area, so Palo Alto, San Francisco, and I can't make a direct comparison to starting a company there versus here. And ultimately here, we have access to amazing talent for less. And cash is king. Not that you're all cheap, you're all wonderful people, but things are insane up there when it comes to starting salaries for people right out of college. And there's value in having that concentration of talent, especially engineering, product, and design talent up there. But outside of those roles, and even within those roles, there's a lot of opportunities to hire people down here who want to live in an amazing climate without spending an absolute fortune on housing or office space. And so We, for instance, would not have found our director of research if we did not have an LA office. She was insistent that she wanted to be down here. And so that made the decision pretty easy for us. Ultimately, to find someone amazing, we had to open up an office down here. And from that, we are now able to grow without spending $140,000 on someone who's 22 years old.
As someone who left the Bay Area to do a bunch of startups, I love hearing other people appreciate that. And to just carry that forward, I want to ask you all a blue sky question that's really directed at the people thinking of starting a company here. Where is this space going? What are the things which you either know are going to happen in the next 5 years, 5 to 8 years, or you don't see anyone doing it, but you think there's this possibility for someone to start a startup around, digital medication. What would you like to say about that?
So I'll sort of take that in two ways. One is on the digital medicine side. I'd really love to see even more activity in kind of the Alzheimer's dementia space. I mean, I think as we all get older, you pay a little bit more attention to that, and we even see it to a limited degree on our platform, and that is, who knew? But our seniors are big gamers. Like, they have all gotten the memo on brain health, and on our platform they're doing Sudoku and word search and solitaire. We had to add more cognitive games on our platform because of our seniors. And so I think there's just a variety of ways to approach it. I think there's obviously been some early traction in that area, but that's an area where I'd like to see it. And I would sort of flip it and just talk a little bit, having come from the hospital side, so you've got the benefit of somebody who has kind of two perspectives here. So if you ask any hospital system across the country about their strategic initiatives, one of the top ones will be that they want to reduce their spend by 30%. Some will say 40%, but typically that's the metric. So look for opportunities where you can reduce spend, you can increase efficiency, and you can improve patient satisfaction. And make sure that when you bring this out, that it has an ability to move the needle. For example, I've had conversations with CFOs and they'll say, Martha, I'm not looking at it unless it's a $20 million swing, right? Because we don't have the capital and resources to solve all of our problems. We have to be very judicious in terms of what we do. So make sure that when you're looking at business problems to solve, that it's a significant one. It's not like you're one of 10 companies that are coming out of an accelerator. Maybe those were the 10 best things that were seen, but they weren't necessarily solving the 10 biggest business problems. And I would tell you that's the disconnect between what we're looking for as operators and what we're seeing potentially coming out of these accelerators. They're really kind of cool ideas, cool technology, but they may not move the needle enough for the kind of work that is involved in bringing innovation into our institution. So a little bit out of the digital medicine side, but I just think maybe that perspective might be helpful to hear in the room.
I think that's very relevant for MedTech at large, so thank you for that. Ben?
So I've been fortunate enough, as far as those 149 conversations with investors, to get a really good sense of what they are looking for. And I'm talking to payer venture arms and health system venture arms and regular health VCs or regular VCs. And ultimately, there's a lot of interest in digital medicine. And from my perspective, that interest can be aligned in people get sick in any number of ways, or they get hurt in any number of ways. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for software to play a key role there. And so as an example, I've seen software designed to help people who are going to have hip surgery so that they can prepare themselves so they're able to recover faster. And that saves money to the hospital. They get out faster. It saves money to the payers. And so you could imagine building that software, running the studies, showing the savings, and getting somebody to buy your product. I see software designed out there for people who've been diagnosed with a very specific form of cancer or with IBS or other disorders, and showing that when people are using that software, they adhere to their medication or their treatment and recovery plans, and they don't go back to the ER, which saves a bunch of money, or any number of things which save the payers money. And we're fortunate because we're in a space right now, there are a lot of competitors out there in digital therapeutics, but we're not really competing with each other because there are so many different disorders. And I think there's not nearly enough companies in our space to create enough software out there for all the different disorders and the variations on those disorders. There's not going to be one cancer digital therapeutic. There's probably going to be a few hundred. based on the different types of cancer and the different populations within those types. So there is a wide blue sky open field out there for people that can create software, have medical expertise, or can attract people with medical expertise, and people who have the experience that Martha might bring to the table, and how you can actually work with hospitals and payers in order to get your products tested and integrated in a way that makes sense, both clinically as well as financially for your customers.
Great. It sounds like there's a lot of room for new entrepreneurs to create value in this space for the whole healthcare system, and especially for future patients. So thank you for that.
Our pleasure.
Sure.
And I think we're basically out of time. And so,
We've got a couple minutes if you want to take an audience
oh,
question.
I would love to if we have time. I don't know who's running the mic, but
They
if
can shout at you.
the gentleman right there, please.
Thank you very much for. Hi, this is Reza Sherkat. I'm the CEO of Wise IoT Solutions. A question for both of you, but mainly for her, that about the data that you can maybe take from when the patients leave the hospital and they go back home to utilize the services at the hospital in a more efficient and more cost-effective.
So I'll start, I'm happy to. I mentioned the 4 B2B channels that we have. We actually have a B2C channel, which we announced at the end of November. And it was always on our roadmap to have AccendoWave at home. And we decided after 4.5 years it was the right time. And that's because we had patients trying to buy our technology every day at the hospital. And I would tell you, as a former hospital executive, nobody was remotely interested in anything that we had. You do not usually go to your local hospital to get the newest and coolest stuff. So now we have that ability to have that home, and it's actually some of our other stakeholders that are interested in that. So it's pharma companies for clinical trials, it's work comp for some of their injured workers. So I think you're gonna see some data gathering from us on that sort of when they come home, and then also kind of preventing readmits in the next, in the 30 days when they've left the hospital, so that we kind of can minimize that. But we're just starting out in that particular arena because we've just gone into that B2C space by virtue of the demand that we were seeing from patients.
I was going to say if
Oh yeah, do you want to share?
I really want to buy this, so I understand. It's beautifully designed, and if you know anything about designing a product and making it user-friendly and user-desirable, you all did a great job.
This is
looks
an EEG
so...
headband. So this is what our patients wear in the hospital. Sorry. So it's just like a pair of glasses, but you put it over your forehead and it just kind of sits there, kind of like Star Wars. And it's pretty comfy. It's got a nice, foam here and foam there on the side. And I would tell you, there's so many learning kernels that you get from doing these sorts of things, but we are all a little bit self-interested. Our patients love seeing information on themselves. They love seeing their own brain waves on the screen. They love seeing the pain scale light up for them. And they love seeing content that changes based on how they're reacting to it. So the brainwave controlled TV for pain, basically. So this is what we use, and we wipe them with Purell. It goes into a UV sanitizing and charging cart because we're in a hospital, so we have to be careful with infection control. But it's really, it's not intimidating, and some of these EEG things can be really kind of off-putting.
And I'd love to take one more question from Sue to bring it home, please.
I think it's great that digital therapies are going through this regulatory process with the trials, the FDA approval, because I think that's what's kept them from being fully accepted as alternatives. So my question is simply, as we're going through that process, how do you think it's impacting the cost of developing digital therapies and therefore the price, given that in the short run, a lot of patients are paying out of pocket?
So probably to me, that's a great question. As an example, we're not commercializing our product until we get through the FDA. I think some companies do. A lot of companies in our space will make their products free or available for research purposes only, especially when it's software only. The real question would be, how much does it cost to get a prescription digital therapeutic through the FDA, and then what are you going to charge? And it is expensive. We're going to probably need to spend over $10 million to get through the FDA, which is a lot of money for a startup, but it's a lot less than a drug, which is about $1 billion to get through the FDA. Then, of course, the real question is, how much do you charge? Our variable costs are pretty much zero, right? Other than the cost of sales and getting a pediatrician on board to prescribe the product. I don't have a good answer for how much our product will cost or how much other products on the market are going to cost. I expect that will really depend on the negotiating leverage of the payers involved, which is similar to pharmaceuticals, which also have very low variable costs compared to what they're charging on the market. Hopefully we're seeing well under $1,000 per patient per year, because you do need to compete with alternatives out there. From our perspective, we see generic antidepressants costing anywhere from $500 to $800 a year-ish, and therapy can cost over $1,000 a year. But ultimately, we want to be accessible to a lot of people. And so what will that pricing look like? I do not know, and I think there's going to be some competing forces from our board of directors with the investors putting capital in, as well as the payers. But we will see, and I expect different prices across different countries as well. Fortunately, competition is what you can see to bring down prices. And so as other companies enter similar spaces and get through the FDA, prices are going to probably drop significantly.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's have a round of applause